whose bodies are worthy of mourning, and whose are simply forgotten when they die. This is a central question raised by Tsitsi Dangarembga's novel, This Mournable Body. It does so by detailing the struggles of a woman in post-independence Zimbabwe. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama and poetry. In each episode I invite an author or expert to give their views on a particular work of literature, and today I'm joined by Stephanie Bird from University College London. I hope our conversation inspires you to read the novel, and if you have anything to say, please do leave us a comment below the video. If you like it, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Stephanie Bird is Professor of German Studies at University College London. She's author of Responses to Nazi Perpetration in Fiction, Complicities and Continuities, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2024. And she's published extensively on the themes of perpetration and complicity. It's a pleasure to welcome Stephanie to the World Literature Podcast. Stephanie, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me on the World Literature Podcast. Great to have you on.
Thanks, Ivan. Thank you for inviting me. Very good to be here.
So we're talking today about This Mournable Body. Could you just give us a bit of information about the novel, why you think people might be interested in reading it?
Okay, well, This Mournable Body is written by Tsitsi Dangarembga, and it's the third of a trilogy that traces the life of the protagonist Tambutsa Zigalka. And it's the first of the trilogy is called Nervous Conditions, which was published in 1988, and that's set in colonial Rhodesia, and the trilogy takes us through to Zimbabwe in the 1990s. So in the first novel, Tambutsa recounts her education at the mission school run by her uncle and the growing distance she feels to her mother's homestead. In the Book of Not, which was then published in 2006, she tells of her experience at one of Rhodesia, Zimbabwe's most elite girls' schools, where she's one of a handful of black girls that 3 to 5% of black pupils allowed to attend the so-called multiracial school. And this elite education is very much an integral part of the state-sanctioned racism in Rhodesia, as it was then, and takes place against the background of really horrific violence of the Second Chimurenga, or uprising, otherwise known as the Zimbabwe War of Independence, that took place from 1964 to 79. And in This Mournable Body, we're now in the 1990s. Tambu, as she's known for short, is embittered. She's disappointed at her own failure to be a successful, high-earning individual, and she's angry and jealous of those who are doing better than her, particularly of other women doing better than her. But she's still ruthless in her determination to succeed. She's also very aware of her age. She's approaching or is in middle age and is consumed with self-loathing. So at the start of the novel, she's in a hostel because she resigned from her job at an advertising agency. I'll perhaps say more about that. She then gets a job as a teacher. She assaults a girl, suffers a breakdown, recovers, and gets a job at a travel agency. And this also ends in failure when she encourages or at the last minute asks the women of the village to dance topless. And this is the sort of climax of quite a long novel. So it's a challenging novel. It's a challenging novel for reasons we can go on and discuss. But it is also quite a gripping and in places very funny novel.
Yeah, I agree with that description of it as challenging. And Yeah, as we were preparing for this, I realized I read Nervous Conditions some time ago. And, not only does the trilogy sort of encapsulate his whole period of Zimbabwean history, but the sort of gap between them is significant as well. Let's start with that historical context then. You talked a little bit about some of the violence, particularly in the Book of Not. Now, This Mournable Body, it does reference historical events and the accompanying violence, but does so very elusively. So we don't really get a particularly clear picture either of Zimbabwe's past or Tambu's past. So why do you think Dangarembga chose to be relatively indirect in the treatment of history and of violence?
I think there is an assumption perhaps that readers will have read the first two novels. I actually read this first before reading the other two and thought, how interesting, here's an author who is demanding quite a lot from her reader, but felt that it didn't make it problematic because the allusions were still present enough to understand that there was a history of of political violence against women, and also the witnessing of violence by Tambu. So as I said, the backdrop is the second Chimurenga, but there's the other violence of what is known as the Gukuruhundi, and apologies for my pronunciation, which was a mass killing or genocide that took place between 1982 to 1907, which was perpetrated by the 5th Brigade of the ZANU, which was a militia associated with Mugabe, which was constituted mainly by Shona people, against the former ZAPU, who were led by Joshua and Como, and they had been in alliance during the War of Independence, and then following independence there was internal civil war or violence, but then this awful mass killing. And one critic actually of the novel, so I will get as well to why it does work, but one critic of the novel has suggested that actually it is a problem that Dangarembga silences the Gukuruhundi, or sort of that we're meant to understand that it's Tambu herself who is ignoring the violence, because it was so important, and the ignorance of the character is negatively reflected in the ignorance of the novel in not addressing that. So that is a critical response to the pushing of the violence into the background. But certainly Dangarembga's reasoning, and I think this plays out in the novel, is that there is a parallel working between Tambu and her individual response to violence and a more pervasive social pattern. So her strategy of avoidance, her strategy of looking away, is a response to having witnessed terrible acts of violence as a girl. So she saw her sister's leg being blown off during the war. That's how the Book of Not starts. And she is fleeing from the memory of that violence. She seeks escape. That's partly what her education offers her. She also witnessed her uncle being nearly beaten to death because he was seen as a collaborator with the colonizers as the head of a missionary school. So she has a very real fear and horror of violence, which persists into her present. Her landlady at one point is knifed, probably by one of her sons. And two of the women who feature quite significantly in the novel are ex-freedom fighters, and they themselves refer sometimes to horrific violence that they witnessed, and the suggestion is that they necessarily participated in. So is it okay if I quote what Dangarembga said in interview?
Please do. Yeah.
She and this is quoting her now, and it's on YouTube for those who want to see a very interesting interview with her. She says, "Look at Zimbabweans. We were complicit with guerrillas during the war because it was the war effort, and also there was terrible retribution if you were not complicit with guerrillas during the war. And so we evolved into that habit. we said we want independence, so we're going to go along with some of the things that were done that were really not the best things for humans to be doing to each other. And so we got into that habit and continued after independence. We didn't then change and say, okay, we're going to start holding people accountable. We're going to conceptualize authority in a different way. No, we carried on. And so this is where we find ourselves now, at the point whether we have to do something about it or things are really going to fall apart. So the parallel with Tambutsai as a character and nation are not really something that I constructed, but something that unfolds in a nation. So the author, and I'm not of the view that what authors intend always plays out in their novels, but I think there is that idea that Tambu at one level does represent the general avoidance of violence, but then what we see is that her avoidance of confrontation generates more violence, because she is actually, and this is one of the things that makes the novel so interesting, she's a violent protagonist. She's embittered. She has herself been undoubtedly a victim of lifelong horrendous racism and also sexism. But she takes out her anger on those who are weaker than her. So on the student at her school, she participates in an episode where she's about to stone a fellow resident, another woman in the hostel that she's staying in. And she doesn't acknowledge her own culpability in her acts of violence. So it is a cycle that we see unfolding. So I think the avoidance, for all that I can understand the criticism that the novel is bypassing something in the way that many would argue that there hasn't been a reckoning, as it were, with the sorry, I have to recall the name, the Gukurahundi, this massacre. I think it works novelistically to have a character who is herself displaying that without thinking about the role of violence in society and at the individual level, that violence will persist. So there is a very strong critique going on.
I think, as you suggested with that last point, of course, it's always worth bearing in mind what literature does as opposed to history, right? Exactly. And we'll come on to the particular form of address that's used a bit later, because I think that's an interesting feature. You mentioned in your summary of the earlier novels the racism kind of inherent in, obviously, the colonial system and in Tambu's schooling. Now, the third novel, which we're talking about, This Mournable Body, is set in Zimbabwe after independence. But she often uses white people as a sort of a yardstick by which she measures her progress in life. And it's part of her sort of embittered character that she does so. Given that historical context and post-independence setting, what do you think is telling us about her own conception of race, and how's the novel commenting on that?
It's really interesting. Because what we see is a woman who has been taught to loathe or to turn her shame about her own black body, being black and being a woman, turning that against herself. So at her school, the black students were made to feel, and I'm citing, biologically blasphemous for being black, and this inculcates a deep loathing of her body that persists and that we see ongoing as an adult. And just to give examples of how blatant the racism is, she achieved the best O-level results in her school, but the O-level trophy was awarded to Tracy, who was a key figure in This Mournable Body, because Tracy achieved the best O-level results for a white girl at the school. So the lesson of a humanist Western education at the Sacred Heart, that meritocracy will earn you the top prize, is in fact the lesson that she learns, or she should have learnt perhaps, but again she doesn't really address, is that meritocracy only applies to white people. And if you're black, the same rules apply. So she has this split of what the education is teaching her, reading all the classics and so forth and so on, and a prize for the best O-levels actually doesn't apply to her. And similarly, the reason that she's unemployed at the beginning of This Mournable Body is because a white colleague at the advertising agency took credit for some advertising copy that was so good it won a prize. But instead of really, she's aware, she's obviously knows that this is what is happening and is angered and is deeply resentful, but her response is to resign. She doesn't confront, she avoids confrontation, and this is indicative of her wider response to the systemic violence of racism. She denies it or simply avoids acknowledging its effects. So there are plenty of times where she's actually been exposed to what we might now generally call critical race theory or theories of race. So her own cousin Nyasha, when they were both still at school, she felt that Nyasha was often a bit sneering about white people. And at the Sacred Heart, she thinks about blackness and perspective and how she couldn't have known what was happening from a certain point of view. And then when she was at university, she laughs in response to another author's, Amata Aidu's declaration that it was being among white people that made her aware of being black. This is her response is to laugh at this and think, oh, how silly. So she turns away from any thinking about racism because she's frightened of the hostility it generates. And she's also, and this is where the novel is so interesting, she's actually profoundly dismayed by the notion, and I quote here from the novel, the notion of one group of people disparaging another so malignantly. So her response to malignant racism and the disparagement that she's been the object of is not then, is an awareness of how awful the malignancy is, and it's not one that she then wants to, or that she in any way wants to return. So she doesn't, I suppose we have a character who doesn't want to enter into conflict as a response to being the object of malign racism, and yet has no other vocabulary or way of articulating or forming another response. So just to give some examples of three key white people in the novel, Tracy. Tracy is actually the woman who gives her the job in the tourism business, and she sees Tracy as a model of what she might want to be: successful, economically powerful, and for a period of time that is exactly what she becomes very successfully. Again, this Tracy is a malignant figure in as far as she simply doesn't understand. I mean, one might say she doesn't even attempt to understand the effects of racism that she benefited from in this this apartheid society. But Tambo doesn't hold Tracy personally responsible. It's quite interesting, that parallel. Then we have Mabel, and this is actually a really interesting encounter that Tambo has with a wealthy widow whom she first meets when she wants a job, but then meets again in the psychiatric hospital when she's had a breakdown. And Mabel, who is becoming senile, mistakes Tambo. Mabel is white. She mistakes Tambo for her daughter. Insists that Tambo is her daughter, and it's both comic. It's very funny, but also there is a moment where Tambo realizes she has self-worth because this woman in her state of senility simply doesn't enact or continue interaction. She sort of simply talks in her senility through race and racial boundaries, and that's a very interesting moment. And then finally, Tambo's encounter with her white cousin brother-in-law, Leon, as she describes him as her cousin brother-in-law. This is Nyasha, her cousin's husband, who is from the former East Germany. And she is utterly, again, very comically baffled and incomprehending of how her cousin could have married Leon, not because he's white, but because he's white and poor. And Europeans cannot possibly be poor. And so the emphasis here of Tambo is not around race, in inverted commas, but is around expectations that white people are wealthy and it's black people who are poor. And how could Nyasha possibly, if she was going to marry a white European, she should surely marry a rich one to get the benefits. And this, so it's an interesting, the novel is exploring how an individual can or fails to need, well, the real difficulties of being a victim of malign and malignant racism, and yet recognizing, categorizing people on the basis of that category is itself at some level malign. So it's a very interesting engagement with the problems of race. Economics are more important, I would say, for Tambo in her conscious aspirations. Not racism has profoundly formed her self-loathing and her and the violence of racism is played out in how she does.
And thank you for that really detailed answer. I think next question hopefully ties together a few of the things we talked about, which is about the title, which references an essay called Unmournable Bodies by the novelist Teju Cole. And in that essay, Cole argues there's an imbalance, or we could say a kind of selective blindness towards violence and hence towards who is mourned, who is not mourned. I guess to not be mourned is to be sort of forgotten, left to be invisible, I suppose. So can you say a little bit about how This Mournable Body is responding to that idea or to those ideas into that essay?
Yeah, I mean, I as I understand Cole's essay, he's very much suggesting that bodies that are unmournable, that this does relate to hierarchies of race and who is privileged over others. So he gives examples of those killed in Mexico, those killed in Gaza or in the Central African Republic. They barely make the headlines, because, as you say, they can be quickly forgotten, or they're less valuable. And I think a critique of these racialized hierarchies is essential to the trilogy. But what makes This Mournable Body particularly fascinating is that it does focus on the harm done to Tambo, because to quote Dangarembga now, describes her protagonist not only black and not only a woman, also a quote post-colonial. So the harm, racism, patriarchy, massively expanding, globalizing, but she explores these harms through who is herself resentful, angry, often violent, and herself wedded to those very financial status and success. So, there is a very strong, it's very easy to think that Tambo was a dislikable. This is text I times teach, and some of my students simply find her straightforwardly dislikable because she doesn't learn. She's not a conventional protagonist who finds redemption. She repeatedly goes back and commits further violence. She repeatedly persists in her pursuit of money, understandably, at a period when poverty is a very real threat to Zimbabweans. So, why wouldn't she want to secure her financial security? But the ambition and the ruthlessness with which she does that, and the value system that comes with it, make her an unlikely victim. So make her a body that is mournable, however unpleasant she might be. And I think that is a real strength of the novel.
Interesting. Thank you.
Does that answer? I don't know if you had something you wanted to add to that in your reading of The Coal.
I think, well, you touched on things I hadn't thought about there. I mean, to me, it was sort of a performative statement almost, by, and we'll get on to the form of address maybe in the next section, but simply by putting this protagonist front and center and having a novel in her voice, that in itself is counteracting the kind of hierarchy that in earlier times might have faced such a protagonist, right? So I think that's how I saw it, but I hadn't thought so much about the likability, which almost rubs against that. I suppose where I'm going with it is we like maybe simplistic narratives that, a traditional funeral service, for example, you eulogize the dead, and list their good qualities. So you have this mournable body created through the act of narration, who is not likable and would sort of be difficult to eulogize in the terms that she represents herself. So it's a very interesting. And yet
she must, she must. Bodies are mournable, however difficult they are. I think that's a profound statement that the novel makes.
Yeah. So let's take a break now, and when we come back, maybe we can get into the voice of the narrative, which is a really fascinating aspect of it. So thank you for all your answers so far, and please, everybody, do join us for part 2.